My Dog and the Witch. I remember that day, every night, and every darkness. During those years, I had the habit of buying several books and piling them up until the day when I would deign to read them arrived. I recall that one afternoon I bought a complete fantasy saga, of which I can't remember the name. I returned home and was arranging them when worry returned to me because Mrs. Christina, our neighbor, had been sick these past few days. We saw many relatives arrive, and I didn't recognize any of them. Perhaps it was time to get used to seeing new faces, at least until our neighbor recovered or passed away. I went downstairs to grab a bite to eat in the early morning, and that's where I found the first book of the saga I had just bought, with almost not a single page next to the dining table. I could only think of Tomas, my younger brother, and I remember being so upset that I thought about doing the same thing with his comics until I found the book pages under the table. It wasn't the discovery itself that shocked me, but how neatly they were arranged. There were 5 pillars formed with them. I took one and confirmed that they were indeed from the book due to the design on the edges, but to my surprise, there were no words. It was as if the printer had run out of ink when printing the author's words. It's impossible, I thought. I remember reading the introduction before putting it on the shelf in my room. I checked the rest of the pages, and they were all the same, except for the last pillar. That one did have words. I thought it was a tasteless prank, so I decided to crawl out from under the table, and that's when our dog surprised me from behind. I couldn't help but notice how his gaze shifted between the pillars I had disarranged and my eyes. Like a fool, I asked if something was wrong, and I swear to God I saw his pupils dilate. I felt intimidated by what I believed was my faithful friend. As I was about to go back to my room, I noticed that my dog was holding a sheet of paper under his paw. I looked at it, and after observing him, he moved aside so I could take it. There was something written. It was the name of a medication, and I remembered it immediately because it's a homemade one, and only Mrs. Pepper, the witch of the neighborhood, sold it for 600 pesos. I don't know who wrote that note, but I felt the need to use it to save Mrs. Christina, who took care of me a lot when I was a child since my parents worked all day. I cherished the old lady very much, and my heart broke at the thought that she might not be in this world overnight. I knew the medication had to be put in a tea, so I asked Mrs. Pepper, the witch, to prepare it herself, just so that the only thing left would be to heat it up just before giving it to Mrs. Christina. I had no problem with that, as I said it was a special tea to relieve her bodily pain, but something went wrong. As I left the house, I heard a commotion behind me. Mrs. Christina had passed away. I refused to believe it was because of the tea. It seemed impossible. I told my best friend about what had happened, and she said that in her family, they had used Mrs. Pepper's medication to cure illnesses, so it wasn't possible for my neighbor to have passed away because of it. I also confessed what had happened with my dog, and she doubted that a bit. It was as if I was telling her a horror story to scare her. To confirm what I told her about my dog, I invited her to my room to see the loose blank pages from the book I had bought. But to my surprise, they were back in the copy, complete with their respective words. That day was the first time my best friend hinted that I needed professional help, using terms to avoid saying the word crazy. I couldn't sleep for days, and since I couldn't talk to anyone, I decided to hug my dog and vent to him. I remember telling him how stupid my best friend was, and in the midst of frustration, I said I wished she would disappear. That's when I realized that my dog wasn't entirely good because a few days later, they found my best friend lifeless a few streets from her house. When the news reached me, I was going to go straight to her house, but at the entrance to mine, my dog was there, holding a piece of paper under his paw again. I bent down to take it, and my body began to feel chills. Better? The piece of paper said. I looked at it in horror. I didn't want to leave my house because of the fears that began to invade my body, and then my dog started following me everywhere. When I slept, he remained motionless at the door, waiting for dawn and for me to wake up. I knew. I was sure he had taken care of her, but I didn't know how to prove it. I tried countless times to get rid of him, but all in vain. I even stopped feeding him, and it was as if he didn't need it. One night, I screamed at him, asking what he wanted and telling him to leave me alone, that I regretted asking him to do such a foolish thing. My nights became worse than I could have imagined. Very strange things began to happen during the nights. My dog's silhouette at the door grew larger and sometimes exceeded the size of a wolf. His footsteps around the bed were as audible as those of heavy work boots. When the clock struck 3 in the morning, he would scratch the wooden bed frame with his claws, and only two sounds could be heard, the wood splintering and my crying. Weeks later, everything got worse. I no longer had the desire to go to school, and my parents noticed that I had become very thin. But I was also terrified because when I looked at them, I was surprised that they didn't hear my crying or the sound of the wood. Once, I went to school and thought about running away from home, but the fear that my dog would find me and do something to me kept me at his mercy. Possibly, the same fate awaited me as my best friend. The crying soon turned into trauma, and at night, I no longer slept but listened to the clock's hands slowly reaching 3 in the morning to hear and feel my dog by my bed again. One weekend, I decided to read one of the books from my shelf, and none of them had printed words. Not even the title on the cover. Time passed, and I didn't know how to get rid of my dog. On the other hand, it was impossible to find a connection between him and the disappearing words. I even began to think that I was completely crazy. One night, during dinner, I heard my mom mention that there was a superstition going around the neighborhood that some neighbors heard their dogs talking, and it was considered normal in the news when the connection between the pet and its owner was very strong. When I went to sleep and my dog stood by the door, I asked him if he could talk, but there was no response. I got frustrated and yelled at him, and then he moved aside and started walking toward me. Seconds later, my parents came in, distressed by my loud screams. I lost my fear of what might happen, so I told them that the dog was bothering me at night and that he had gotten rid of my best friend. I didn't want to tell them anything about Mrs. Christina. I looked and pointed at my dog while telling my parents this, but when my dad turned to look at him, I noticed that he glanced from side to side, and when he turned back to me, I was frozen when I heard his response. "Which dog?" They couldn't see him, but to me, it was as clear as day. I spent days trying to convince them that what I was saying was real, but I didn't realize that I was forcing them to make a decision they didn't want to make, take me to a professional or commit me to a psychiatric hospital. That's when my traumas were discovered, and the doctors said I was schizophrenic. I refused to believe that, and my parents had no choice but to take me out of school due to several violent episodes I had. Time passed, and I stopped seeing the dog, but his presence didn't go away. Books fell at night. Drawers opened and closed violently, and only I could hear them. Outside my window, several dogs gathered to watch me. I don't know how many nights they stood there waiting for me to notice them. I thought about praying and asking God for help, but I had never believed in him, so in a desperate situation, I asked my parents to bring Mrs. Pepper. Seeing my interest in getting better, they agreed. Her good reputation also helped. From my room, I could hear when she arrived. I waited for her patiently, and when she entered, she was accompanied by the same dog that tormented me every night. She asked my mother to leave us alone, and my mom obeyed. Throughout the meeting, she laughed, as if she were mocking me. She sat on the bed, and the dog lay by the door. It looked somewhat different, but something told me it was him. I knew it was him. Mrs. Pepper didn't hold back or waste any of her words. She told me that she didn't understand me. All my wishes had been granted, and yet I suffered because of them. I quickly understood that she knew about the dog, but I couldn't deduce if she had sent it or not. When I asked her, she told me that it was my brother who had summoned the dog through an innocent ritual that was supposed to have no effect. The strange thing about this is that the dog only asked for books to eat, and since my brother refused, the dog decided to take mine. That's when I remembered that it was he who had given it to me, claiming that he didn't want that responsibility. I asked how I could get rid of it, and she gave me that famous medication in tea that only she knows how to make. I drank it, and then she left. My nights returned to normal, and I asked my parents to let me go back to school and accepted the help of the psychologist. It was then that they revealed to me that the dog my brother had given me had sadly passed away months later when it was still very young, confirming that only I could see it. Time passed, and I managed to recover, but when I told my horror story, no one believed me. When I entered university, it seemed like a topic that amused others, and that's how I made many friends. I never knew why the words in the books disappeared, and I didn't ask Mrs. Pepper. I suppose the dog used them to write those pieces of paper. And believe it or not, I still have a piece of paper, the last one, the one that says, "Better." I don't know why, but I carry it everywhere, and I never blamed my brother for anything. Maybe he didn't know what he was doing, but because of that, I decided never to have a pet again. I continued with my life, although it would be impossible to lie and say that I have met people so unpleasant that I feel like talking about them with my dog. Story written for Dark Secret by Johnny.